February 10th, 1941. Plymouth, England. The cold morning fog clung to the streets, its thick blanket obscuring everything in sight. The usual hum of the city was replaced by an uneasy silence. In the shadow of the English Channel, a young man named James Henderson sat at his station in a small, dimly lit radio room, its walls lined with the hum of aging equipment and the crackling of static. To most, this room, buried deep within the heart of Plymouth's naval base, was little more than a forgotten outpost, a place where men with tired eyes sent and received signals that, to the untrained ear, made little sense. But to Henderson, it was the pulse of the war, the heart of everything. His hands were steady, poised over the worn keys of his Morse code transmitter. His focus was absolute. Outside, the relentless pounding of the bombs and the screech of diving planes were merely sounds from another world. In this small room, Henderson was far from the chaos. He was its commander. Every message he received and every code he sent carried the weight of life and death, of victory and defeat. He had been at this for hours, decoding and relaying communications, each message a piece of the puzzle. It was nothing new, no surprise. This was his job, to listen, to analyze, and to relay the critical information that could change the course of battle. And yet, as he typed, a strange unease settled in his chest. Something was wrong. It was a feeling he couldn't quite place, an instinct honed over years of service that told him something was slipping through the cracks, something important that everyone else had missed. He had no solid evidence, no glaring, undeniable signal that screamed urgency. It was just a hunch. But in war, a hunch could be everything. One wrong decision, one overlooked message, and lives could be lost. It was this paradox of war. The finest lines were often invisible, the most important decisions hidden in plain sight. Outside the window, the dull thud of anti-aircraft fire vibrated through the walls, followed by the distant sound of engines. German bombers, surely, making their way toward Plymouth. But still, James's fingers didn't falter. The radio crackled to life again. It was an incoming transmission, one that hadn't been expected. A report from a reconnaissance plane. A coded sequence he hadn't seen before. A string of numbers. His brow furrowed. The message was clear enough, but there was something about it, a strange pattern, an irregularity in the transmission. Most operators would have dismissed it, chalked it up to interference or the limitations of wartime technology. But not Henderson. He ran his fingers across the keys again, translating the code with a speed and precision that seemed almost too calm for the chaos unfolding outside. He felt the unease in his gut tighten. He paused, letting his mind sift through the implications of the message. It wasn't an ordinary reconnaissance report. It wasn't just information on enemy movement or potential targets. It was something else, something more urgent. A warning, perhaps? The sirens wailed, slicing through the room like a knife, snapping him from his thoughts. Another wave. The Luftwaffe was on its way. Henderson didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to, but he could hear the rush of footsteps outside, the scrambling of soldiers preparing for the inevitable. The sky would soon be filled with the deadly engines of war, and there would be no hiding from it. The radio came to life again, but this time it was different. A frantic call, a crackling voice that barely rose above the static. It was coming from a ship in the channel, a convoy being targeted by German bombers. Henderson's heart raced. The ship's radio operator was in a panic, trying desperately to relay coordinates. The line was full of distortion, but Henderson understood. They were off course. They were headed straight for danger, and no one had noticed. James could already hear the explosion of bombs as they struck the convoy, the deafening sound of metal tearing, of men screaming, of ships sinking. But there was nothing he could do. He couldn't be in two places at once. Still, the sinking feeling in his chest didn't fade. He had the coordinates. He had the message. He had the warning. But it was already too late for the men on that ship. The guilt gnawed at him. This was the paradox of his existence. He was a cog in a massive machine, one that ran on routine, on protocol. And yet, at moments like these, he felt the weight of the entire war on his shoulders. If only someone had listened. If only they'd paid attention to the signals, to the small details that he knew, deep down, would make the difference. But they hadn't. James sat back, eyes narrowed, letting the hum of the radio settle in. The world outside was a storm. The men on the front lines were facing a firestorm of steel and fire. And yet, here he was, in the eye of it all, a man who was powerless to change the course of events. But then, something flickered. The radio came to life once more. Another message, but this time it was clearer, sharper. Another report, another warning, this time from an entirely different source. It was urgent. It was direct. And Henderson didn't hesitate. He keyed in the coordinates, preparing to relay the message to higher command. But before he could send it, something stopped him. A command from above, a direct order to disregard it. His heart sank. He had seen this before. The bureaucracy, the indifference, the institutional blindness that blinded the decision-makers to the critical data that people like him were feeding them. Time and again, men like him would risk everything, only to be silenced. The orders were clear: don't bother the higher-ups with trivial matters. The ship was on its own. The lives of those aboard would be left to fate. His hand hovered over the keys for a long moment, the weight of the decision heavy on his chest. He had no authority, no power to challenge the command. And yet, something inside him told him that this wasn't right. This was a line in the sand. He had the information. He had the warning. He could make the difference. But what if he was wrong? What if his instincts were leading him down a dangerous path? What if his intervention only served to create chaos, to disrupt an already fragile system? The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed to grow louder, each second dragging on for eternity. And then, without a second thought, Henderson made his choice. He typed the message and sent it out, knowing full well that the higher-ups might never act on it. But it was out there now. He had done everything he could. The rest was up to them. For a moment, the world outside felt distant, removed. The sirens wailed, the bombs fell, but inside the small radio room, there was only the sound of Henderson's breath and the steady pulse of his fingers on the keys. There was nothing more he could do now. But still, as the bombs fell and the night stretched on, a question lingered in his mind. What would happen if no one listened? What if, in the end, the information he had sent was nothing more than a whisper in the storm? Would anyone ever truly understand the weight of the choices that had been made in the quiet corners of war? As the static on the radio crackled, signaling a break in the transmission, Henderson couldn't help but feel the crushing weight of history bearing down on him. There were battles fought in the open, in the skies and on the seas. But there were also battles fought in silence, behind closed doors, in small rooms where the decisions that shaped the course of history were made in whispers and gut instincts. And as he sat there, alone in the dimly lit radio room, Henderson knew that the story of his war, of all the unsung heroes like him, would never be told. The men who spoke calmly while the world burned around them would remain nameless, faceless, forgotten by history. They would be lost to time, erased by the weight of bureaucracy and the machine that powered it all. But in that moment, as the radio flickered with static and the distant sound of war raged on, Henderson knew that he had done something that few others ever would. He had acted. Even when the world turned a blind eye, he had spoken. And in the end, that would have to be enough. March 3rd, 1941. Aboard the HMS Belfast, the cold wind whipped through the steel skeleton of the ship, howling like a wounded animal as it cut across the deck. The massive warship, part of the British Navy's heavy cruiser fleet, was no stranger to danger. It had been in battle after battle, braving the Atlantic storms, the deadly cat-and-mouse game with German U-boats, and the ever-present threat of aerial bombardment. But today, as it sailed through the choppy waters of the North Sea, there was a different kind of tension in the air. The Luftwaffe was on the move, and the skies above were about to become a killing field. Below deck, in the cramped and dimly lit radio room, James Henderson sat hunched over his station, a small, worn headset clutched to his ear. His fingers hovered over the keys of the Morse code transmitter as he listened to the radio chatter. The static of war was a constant companion. The crackle of distant explosions, the hum of enemy aircraft in the distance, the urgent, distorted voices of fellow operators. But today there was something more. A sudden and strange message had come through, one that hadn't been anticipated. It wasn't coded in the usual way, and it wasn't just another report from a reconnaissance flight. It was different, raw, unpolished, a fragmented cry for help. He adjusted his headset and leaned forward, narrowing his eyes as he deciphered the code. A distress call, sent from a convoy in the channel, was buried deep within the noise. The ships had been under attack for hours, their radio operators barely holding it together as bombs rained down. The message was incomplete, but it was clear enough to Henderson. The convoy was lost, and no one had realized it yet. The wrong course had been plotted. The ships were headed straight for the heart of the German airstrike. As he typed the message, he felt a sharp pang of urgency course through him. It wasn't just a report he was forwarding. This was a warning, a call to action. Lives were at stake, and time was slipping away. But there was a problem. The higher-ups were already aware of the convoy's position, or so they thought. The ship's captain, the commanders, the entire chain of command was focused on other priorities. The enemy's planes were closing in, and their attention was elsewhere. This was the reality of war. Too much information, too many voices, and too little time to act on it all. Henderson's hand hovered over the transmitter key as he thought about his next move. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He was just a radio operator, a cog in the machine. His job was to receive and transmit information, to follow orders, not to challenge the system. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this was different. This wasn't just about sending messages. This was about saving lives, about stepping outside the lines, about doing something no one else would. The sirens began to wail, their eerie scream filling the ship, followed by the unmistakable roar of German bombers overhead. Henderson's breath caught in his throat as he felt the vibration of the impact, distant but unmistakable. The first wave had begun. The convoy was still on its doomed course, unaware of the danger approaching. But Henderson knew. He had the coordinates, the warning, and he couldn't stay silent. He sent the message, pushing the words through the airwaves with all the urgency he could muster. But as soon as the transmission left his hands, he knew it wouldn't be enough. The message had to reach the right people, the right officers, the right command center. But in the fog of war, who would hear it? Who would care? The minutes stretched on, each one longer than the last. Outside, the sky was filled with the thundering sound of German bombers diving down toward the convoy. Henderson could almost feel the heat of the explosions through the hull of the ship. The tension in the radio room was palpable. He couldn't let go of the feeling that something was wrong. Something was slipping through the cracks, and he was the only one who could see it. The air around him felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the weight of the world was pressing down on his shoulders. But then, something unexpected happened. The transmission crackled again, this time clearer than before. A voice, breathless and desperate, came through the static. It was from the convoy's radio operator, still trying to send out a call for help, even as the bombs fell around him. His voice was shaking, but the message was clear. The convoy had already suffered heavy casualties. Several ships had been sunk, and the remaining vessels were scattered, their coordinates lost in the chaos. And yet, the most crucial detail was buried within that transmission. The convoy had been diverted. The wrong course had been plotted, and it was only a matter of time before they collided with an even greater threat. Henderson's heart raced. The entire convoy was now in the path of a Luftwaffe bombing raid. The miscalculation would cost them everything. His mind raced as he processed the information. He had to act fast. Time was running out. The convoy would be wiped out unless he could get the message to the right people. But how? The chain of command was clogged with bureaucracy, and higher-ups were preoccupied with larger targets. Would anyone listen? Could anyone even understand the gravity of the situation? Henderson's fingers moved with the precision of a man who had no time to waste. He sent the coordinates again, this time with more urgency, more detail. He outlined the situation as clearly as he could, hoping that someone, anyone, would hear the call. His heart pounded in his chest as the seconds ticked by. The radio operator's voice had become quieter now, drowned out by the growing chaos of the bombing raid. It was almost as if the whole world was collapsing in on itself, and Henderson was the only one still holding on. Outside the radio room, the sounds of destruction were impossible to ignore. The ship rocked as the air shook with the reverberations of distant explosions. The crew moved with purpose, the battle-hardened sailors rushing to their stations, their expressions grim. The ship's deck was now a battlefield in its own right. And yet, in the radio room, Henderson remained an observer, detached, focused, but completely aware of the chaos unfolding just beyond the thin metal walls. He received a brief acknowledgement, a confirmation from the command center that his message had been received. But that was all. No orders, no immediate action, no recognition of the urgency he had felt. The higher-ups were still too focused on other priorities, their attention elsewhere. They didn't understand. They couldn't understand. This wasn't just another transmission. This was the last chance to save the convoy, and they hadn't even acknowledged it. Henderson sat back in his chair, his mind spinning. He had done everything he could. The message had been sent. The information was out there. But would it make a difference? Would anyone listen in time? He couldn't know. But what he did know was that the men on that convoy were facing their deaths, and no one seemed to care. As the ship rocked again, this time more violently, Henderson's thoughts flashed to the men on the convoy. The radio operator who had first sent out the distress call. The men who had no idea they were being led into danger. The officers who would never know what happened in those final moments. And the people who would never know the full story, the ones whose names would be erased from history. He had done what he could, and now, all he could do was wait. The clock on the wall ticked on, and the ship continued its course, its engines roaring through the cold sea. The bombs kept falling. The explosions kept rocking the ship, but Henderson remained still. The war was far from over, but in this small room, at this moment, Henderson knew that no matter what happened next, he would never forget the weight of this decision. The paradox was clear now. He had done everything right, yet it might not have been enough. The system was too slow, too caught up in its own gears. And in the end, it was men like Henderson, invisible, unsung, forgotten, who would bear the weight of it all. April 12, 1942. The war was raging on, but for James Henderson, the action had long passed. He sat behind a desk now, his uniform as crisp as it had ever been, but something had changed. The sharp edge of urgency that once coursed through his veins, the drive that kept him awake for hours, focusing on nothing but the hum of the radio and the pulse of the messages he sent out, was gone. He hadn't touched a Morse code key in weeks. The rhythmic tapping that once felt like his heartbeat had been replaced with the monotony of paperwork, reports, and forms, the language of bureaucracy. His reassignment to an administrative position was a curious one. It was as if the higher-ups had decided that his skill set, his quick thinking, his ability to act in the face of overwhelming odds, was no longer necessary. Maybe they thought it had been a fluke. Or maybe, just maybe, they knew that someone like James Henderson, someone who dared to make decisions that went against the grain, was a risk. They had put him in this new role, stripped of his responsibility, and placed behind a desk where nothing moved, nothing mattered. He was invisible now, just another nameless cog in a much larger machine.